My sincere thanks to our friends over on Patreon. I appreciate your continued support. I'd also welcome you to join us in the More Christ community. If you do so, you'll receive a number of perks, including our online book club, where you'll receive free ebooks, early access to new episodes of More Christ, and promotions for in-person events. I'd also welcome you to share the podcast, and give a 5-star rating, depending on where you're listening or watching the podcast. And thank you all, and God bless. Hey, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by Dr. Holly Ordway. Holly is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, and she's a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University in the USA. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. It's also in the States, and she's a subject editor for the Journal of Inklings Studies. Her book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, received the 2022 Mythopoeic Society Scholarship Award in Inklings Studies. And her newest book then, Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography, which was released in time for the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death on September the 2nd of this year, 2023. And so it's that latter book that we're going to home in on today. So I suppose, first of all, Holly, what moved you to write this book? And I suppose, what are some of its distinctives now that there's an increasing interest in Tolkien? And what do you ultimately hope that readers will take away from it then?
Oh, there's about 3 great questions in there, so we don't have to backtrack and pick up ones that I don't get right away. So I've been interested in Tolkien my whole life, really. Grew up reading his books, and have been engaged with thinking and writing about Tolkien, for close to 30 years now. Wrote Tolkien's Modern Reading, which was the previous book about his engagement with modern literature. And found, as I was doing that topic, turning up lots of really interesting material where he was speaking about his faith. Now, I knew he was a Catholic, knew he was a sincere Catholic. This is acknowledged in the biographies, but it's a bit downplayed, as if, he was a Catholic, but, and then they move on to all the rest of his life. And I realized, as I was reading more and more of his own letters and the reflections of those who knew him, interviews, recollections, that really it was a much more significant part of his life than any previous biography had attended to. And I realized that there was no book that specifically looked at his life of faith. There were books that looked at the Christian themes in his writings, but often these kind of jump straight into it without a grounding in what he actually believed. And then just looking at biographically, there's nothing. So I said to myself, I think I should write that book. And given that the 50th anniversary of his death was on the horizon, I thought this is a good date to aim for. And so those two things came together, and that was the timing and the motivation immediately to do Tolkien's Faith, because it's the only treatment of his faith from a biographical perspective. And I discovered when I was writing it that there is so much more material than had been recognized available, but scattered around interviews, letters, references in his writings, to bring all of that together. And then the next step, to contextualize it, because I'm an American, as you can probably tell from my accent, apart from, where I live. And I know that most Americans really, this is an understatement, don't understand English culture. Sure, we speak the same language, but even then there's a lot of differences. But I have had the great privilege of spending about 3 months of every year in the UK for 10 or 12 years now, actually more than that, close to 15. I'm based in Oxford when I'm in the UK. And of course, Oxford is where Tolkien lived most of his adult life. I am myself a Catholic. There are not many Catholic Tolkien scholars. And I realized that part of the difficulty was that people writing about Tolkien simply didn't understand the context. And so one of the questions I set out to address in Tolkien's Faith was not merely to pull together all of what we know about his life of faith, but also to put it in context. What was it like to be a Catholic in 20th century Birmingham, in mid-20th century Oxford? What were the influences on Tolkien's life that came from that environment, and then explaining that to readers who might have, for instance, no idea who are the Oratorians and why were they important in Tolkien's life. What was it like to be, a Catholic convert? Not easy, to say the least. And that was another major motivating factor in writing this book.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Holly. And I suppose to that end, then you begin the book with reference to Tolkien's faith and this distinctly Christian nature of his work, like The Lord of the Rings, famously, and you highlight some of the nuances in that relationship. Can you maybe speak a bit more to that and help us see beyond some of the misconceptions about the relationship between Tolkien's personal faith and the quasi-religious nature of his works then?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because really there are sort of two equal and opposite misconceptions, like matter and antimatter. One of the misconceptions I've sort of alluded to is that his work doesn't have any influence from his faith. That sure, he was a Catholic in his free time, etc., but because The Lord of the Rings in particular doesn't have any overt Christian content, in contrast to C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, it's relatively straightforward to see the Christian elements there, although that is not an allegory either, just for the viewers' edification. But you can look at the surface level of his writings and say, there's nothing here that's explicitly Christian, therefore there's really no important Christian element in his work. That's a misconception. But on the other hand, there's another misconception, which comes primarily from Catholic readers who, knowing that he's Catholic, they recognize some of the themes in there. For instance, they'll see some connections like, oh, there are Marian figures. Galadriel is a Marian figure. Oh, Lembas, the Lembas spread is very Eucharistic. And these are genuine connections. These are real connections. But then the mistake is to assume that everything in The Lord of the Rings is some sort of gospel allegory. And then we're off to the races. We're finding religious parallels with things that had nothing to do with it. And it becomes this gigantic puzzle of allegorical messiness. And that's completely not the case. Tolkien's very clear that his book is not an allegory and that anything that's going on is under the surface. So that's not correct either. So what we have to do is figure out, okay, there's something, definitely something, because he himself says so very clearly many times, including that most famous comment with which I begin Tolkien's Faith, where he says, The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Okay, but what does it mean that it's fundamentally religious and Catholic? And because he goes on and he says, that's why I've, not put in the overt religious references. He says it's in the story and the symbolism. So it's there, it's foundational, it's fundamental. I think he chooses that word very carefully. It's fundamental, but it's implicit, it's subtle, it's thematic, it's hidden. And then we're equipped to engage with his world, I think, in a more fruitful way, recognizing there are these very important Catholic elements, but seeing them as he intends and not sort of imposing them.
That's excellent. And another misconception that you highlight in the book is this notion that Tolkien was a lifelong Catholic, and you discuss his origins in South Africa and the family's move to Birmingham and so on. I wonder if you might speak a bit more to that religious milieu that he and the family grew up in, and some of the challenges in that kind of that society that had a clear Anglican hegemony in some ways.
Yeah, so he was born in South Africa to a family. His mother and father, Mabel and Arthur, were Anglicans, Church of England. And so he was baptized in the Church of England. And he and his little brother came over to England with his mother for what was supposed to be just a visit. But when he was 4 years old, they were still in Birmingham. They learned that his father had died quite suddenly of an illness in South Africa. And so they never returned. So here we have his mother, young widow, 2 little boys. And so she starts raising them on her own, some support from the family. And somewhere along the lines, in the next couple of years, Mabel, his mother, becomes a Catholic. And this is pivotal in Tolkien's life because that changes the whole trajectory of the family. She's received into the Catholic Church in the year 1900 when Tolkien was 8. And this is why it's important to underscore that he wasn't exactly a lifelong Catholic, because at 8 years old, he had experienced religious life in the Church of England. His parents had been devout Anglicans, so he had gone to church. And we have a big change from going to a beautiful parish church with clergymen, usually married, giving the service in English, over to now they're going to a much shabbier and less impressive building for Catholics. The mass is in Latin. We have a celibate priest. People are using devotions that he's never seen before. The rosary is not a thing that he would have encountered until he became a Catholic. So that change was very clear to him. And he was a very, very bright boy, as we can imagine, and he had an extremely strong visual memory, extremely strong memory in general. So he remembered that change. And his sort of convert nature is emphasized by the fact that he was just old enough that he was past the age of reason. And so in the way that the church handled things at the time, he was not sort of grandfathered in as a Catholic with his mother. He would have been considered to join the church as an adult when he received his first Holy Communion and confirmation, which was later. First Holy Communion was later in those days. So he had both of those at the same time, just before his 12th birthday. So he would have remembered first that transition when his mother became a Catholic, and therefore as a family, they began worshiping as a Catholic. And also, a few years later, that he professed his faith as a Catholic. And that really stuck with him. He knew that this was a decision, first his mother had made, then that he had made. And I think that's important to emphasize because it was really tough to be a Catholic at that time. A lot of anti-Catholic prejudice. And doing the research for Tolkien's Faith was eye-opening because I knew obviously that, the United Kingdom had a very long history of Catholic persecutions. After the Reformation, we have the penal times, and Catholicism is legal, and people are executed for it. And then those end, things lighten up, and so it's legal to become a Catholic and be a Catholic, but there were still so many disadvantages. Catholics still didn't have all of their full legal rights until Tolkien's adulthood, and very much a marginalized community. So it was really disadvantageous to be a Catholic. And there would have been, as Tolkien was growing up, a lot of pressure for him to revert back to his Anglican origins. He had his grandparents and uncles and aunts on both sides would have loved if he had come back into the Protestant fold. They would have been thrilled. And he doesn't. And then he goes off to Oxford and, has a first year there of not practicing his faith terribly well. He lapses a bit in his observances. Very common college student experience. He ends up revitalizing that practice of his faith. But at Oxford, he would again have been a minority in very much an Anglican establishment world. And that continues his whole career. So there was always going to be this temptation and pressure to either compartmentalize his faith or minimize it or revert back to being an Anglican. And I found that helps us to better appreciate his actual life of faith, because it's not something we can just take for granted. Oh, of course he was Catholic. He, his first official biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, doesn't really understand his faith, to put it, sort of in a nutshell. And he points to Tolkien's devout faith as just being inherited from his mother, that it was an emotional attachment to his mother. Now, his mother was a very strong influence on his faith. He admired her greatly. He called her a martyr for the faith because she refused to give it up, even, when it would have been easier for her to do so. She died of diabetes, partly brought on by the poverty and suffering of, related to that. But we can't take it for granted that just because he had a great love for his mother, that he would stick with the faith that she had brought him into. Psychology is not that simple. He could easily have been resentful and said, you might have lived longer, Mom, if you had gone back to being an Anglican, and then our family would have welcomed you and they would have taken proper care of you. He could easily have been very angry at her for becoming a Catholic. Mm-hmm. And even if he wasn't, again, so many pressures to leave his Catholicism, he could easily have said, oh, well, it was important to my mother. It was a nice thing to grow up in as a child, but now I'm a man, I'm going to take my own path. But he didn't. And I think that conscious, intentional hanging on to the faith makes it much more evident that this is a really important part of who he is, what he does, how he writes, much more than if you think that it was just sort of a holdover from his mom.
That's excellent. Thank you. Most clarifying too, Holly. And something that I find interesting too is considering that he did lose his father so young, you then emphasize the distinctive role that different priests played in his life, from the Birmingham Oratory that you previously mentioned and on into Oxford with figures like Father Francis and even my fellow Irishman, Father Basil. That was cool. Would you like to speak to that and how they served the young Tolkien and helped form him in the faith then?
Yeah, I mean, he becomes fully an orphan by the time he's 12. But he'd lost his mother. He lost his mother at age 12 and his father at age 4, and he barely had any recollection of his father because they had left South Africa even before then. So we have very much a fatherless boy, and into that void comes Father Francis Morgan, who was a priest at the Birmingham Oratory, which was where Mabel brought the boys to become parishioners there. Very interesting choice, and wasn't the most prestigious or beautiful church in the area, but the Oratorians were mostly converts. They understood the convert experience, so very savvy choice by Mabel. And Father Francis goes to visit this young family, his new parishioners. They become friends, and then when Mabel realizes that she's soon to die, she makes a will in which she makes Father Francis the guardian of her 2 boys, Tolkien and his younger brother Hilary. And the neat thing is that, Father Francis, he could have just been a legal guardian, but he did so much more. He really stepped in to become a father to the boys, and Tolkien later called him his second father. He was basically exactly the same age as his own father, Arthur. They were born just 2 weeks apart, and he fills that fatherly role. It wasn't always easy. There were, difficulties, especially when Tolkien fell in love with Edith, his future wife. But he's a real father figure, and I think that provides a stability in Tolkien's life that was so needed. Tolkien later called it the miraculous love and care that Father Francis gave him. I mean, it must have seemed, like a miracle. But there's also this whole community of Oratorian fathers. And that was something that I didn't fully realize until I did the research for this book, because most people know about Father Francis if they've done any reading into Tolkien's life. But there were loads of other fathers at the Birmingham Oratory. There were 15 or 20 of them. And Tolkien became, as he put it, virtually a junior inmate of that oratory once, he was under the guardianship of Father Francis. He was involved there. He served Mass there usually every day. He was part of the life of the oratory. He would have been mentored not just by Father Francis, but by a lot of others who spent time with him. He and his brother were part of the Oratorian Boy Scout troop, which is just kind of fun. And so they were mentored then by the father who was in charge of the Boy Scouts. So we have this whole kind of brotherhood of fathers who help to bring up these boys. And all of this is sort of infusing his spirituality with the ethos of the Oratorians, which is really important for Tolkien's spiritual formation. There's a great emphasis on beauty. There's a great emphasis on reverence and worship. Confession, the sacrament of confession, is highly valued, and that became really a key feature of Tolkien's spiritual life, as with veneration of of the Eucharist. So Eucharistic devotion, likewise important to Tolkien, likewise something that was formed at the oratory. And there's an emphasis on humility and humor that's a really distinctive aspect of the oratory and spirituality. You wouldn't think it, but being silly is actually part of their spirituality, all the way back to St. Philip, their Holy Father, who would play jokes and do silly things specifically so that he would stay humble and so that he would stay grounded and down to earth. And that's a spirituality that is pretty distinctive. It's not, there isn't such a big role for humor and jokes in every spiritual, tradition. But it's really important to the oratorians. And I think we can trace that in Tolkien's own life, all the way to when he is an older man. He's become world famous as the author of the Lord of the Rings. And he keeps himself humble with these kind of silly jokes, silly behavior. And I think that can be traced back to that oratorian foundation. And I think it's a good part of the reason why he never became one of those, swelled head authors who thinks he's, the best thing ever. Tolkien was always remarkably humble.
I mean, that's excellent. And I suppose Edith may have played a part in that. And I suppose I'd like to turn to her next and ask about really what was at the heart of their relationship and what enabled them to overcome some of the many challenges and the separations that they had. And then how did they come to wed? Can you tell us a little bit about that love story then?
It's a remarkable story. And you would think that you can't make up stuff like this. It's too good to make up. So he actually fell in love with Edith when they were both lodgers at the lodging house where Father Francis had put the boys, because there was no room for them to stay in the oratory, so he puts them in a lodging house. They're looked after by a couple there. And Edith Bratt was also an orphan. She was a Protestant, and she was also living in that lodging house. And first she becomes friends with the Tolkien boys, and then teenage Tolkien just falls in love with her. Okay, this is all good, except that he kind of loses his head a little bit. He starts neglecting his schoolwork. Of course, he was procrastinating about other things too. As he pointed out, he was always, he should have been studying classics. He's learning Finnish just for fun, that kind of thing. This was always his way. He was a great procrastinator by, learning new languages as one does, right? But it wasn't helping that now he has a girlfriend. And this is really relevant because he's trying to get a scholarship to go to Oxford University. And it's necessary that he gets a scholarship because although Father Francis is actually helping to support the boys out of his own money, there wasn't enough money to pay for him to go if he didn't get a scholarship. And I think Father Francis knew very early on that his ward was a brilliant young man who needed to have a university education, and he needed to get a world-class university education. He needed to go to Oxford. His scholarship had to try again the next year. So Father Francis is worried about him, being distracted. That's sort of one concern. And then Tolkien and Edith, they start going off together, long walks, jaunts, all perfectly innocent in themselves, but they were lying about it. They were concealing it. And not just concealing by not telling about it, but directly lying. Oh, I'm going to do this. And instead he's off with Edith. And when Father Francis found out about that, he laid down the law. You cannot see her. And this sounds so harsh, I think, to us, individualistic, romantic type people in the modern age. But if you think about it from Father Francis' perspective, he doesn't know anything about Edith. She's just a girl, that is in the same house. And why is Tolkien not talking to him about it. If he's serious about this girl, she's not a Catholic, so they have to have that conversation. How is this going to unfold? Now, it's important to note, in that era, it was a much bigger deal for there to be a mixed marriage between a Catholic and a Protestant, but it was absolutely possible. In fact, Father Francis himself was the child of a mixed marriage. His father was a Protestant and his mother was a Catholic. Certainly doable. So Edith, her being a Protestant didn't necessarily mean that they couldn't be together. It just meant that they would have to talk about it. But if he's not even bringing it up, I'm sure Father Francis was thinking, is this serious? And most importantly, why is he lying about it? And is this girl leading him into a path of deception and dishonesty? Okay, not good, not good. So he separates them, and he ends up giving, this was the ultimatum to Tolkien: you can't see her or write to her until you come of age. And that's 3 years till his 21st birthday. But the really amazing and beautiful thing is that Tolkien obeys. He said it was very hard and painful, and I bet it was, but he obeys him. And the striking thing is he does that even after he goes to Oxford. Once he's in Oxford, Father Francis is not right there. He could have written to Edith anytime, and he wouldn't have known. But Tolkien writes in one of his letters that he could have deceived his guardian, but his guardian had been a father to him. He had to obey him, but the had to was the imperative of love. He could have deceived him, and Father Francis would never have known, but he loved his second father. He knew he was looking out for him, as hard as it might be. So he obeys, and then, doesn't see her, doesn't write to her. And then on the eve, the very day of his 21st birthday, midnight comes, he writes to her. Okay, I'm free of, I'm free of my obligation. And he writes to her, and he renews his hope that they would be married, sends off the letter. All very romantic. And then he gets back the response from Edith that she is actually engaged to another man. That must have been a bit of a shock. So Tolkien, nothing daunted, writes back to her. She agrees to meet with him. He takes the train down to see her. In the course of one afternoon, he manages to convince her to break off her engagement, because it turns out that she didn't really love this other chap. She just felt like, well, will Tolkien remember me after 3 years, or will I be left alone? She breaks off her engagement, gets engaged to Tolkien, and then eventually they do become married. So quite a romantic story. But that 3-year separation, as hard as it was, Tolkien later said, was really the only thing that could have actually firmed up their relationship and turned it from just a boyish sort of crush into a mature love. So it's just a remarkable story.
That's beautiful. I appreciate it. Thanks for sharing, Holly. And we're doing a real whistle stop tour, so there's so many more good things. You lay out your book perfectly in this beginning, middle, and end narrative, and I'd love to get into everything, but I'm going to jump to the middle now to keep us on track, to try and give a big picture perspective. And I'd love to ask about the influence of the war, the impact of the war on Tolkien, and what were some of the forces, I suppose, internal and external, that led him into battle during the First World War, and I suppose ultimately what indelible impression then did that leave upon him and his work?
Yeah, so it quite a dramatic era that he found himself in. He fought in the First World War, and his sons fought in the Second. What a century. So he was at Oxford when war was declared, and he put off joining the forces as long as he could, because he wanted to get his degree. He was aware that he wanted to marry Edith and support her, and so he grits his teeth and stays in, although at that time that itself took a certain amount of courage, because there was a lot of pressure that young men had to enlist right away. A lot of pressure. He said he faced some severe criticism. So he finishes the degree, goes in the army in 1916. He married Edith actually just really a month or so before he ends up going off to war. And he's a signals officer. And so he ends up serving in the front lines on the Somme. And there he would have seen just the most terrible devastation and slaughter. And it had a profound effect on him. And I think for anyone who's interested in exploring, the bigger picture of his war experiences, the Tolkien scholar John Garth has a great book called Tolkien and the Great War, which really traces a lot of the important elements in that experience and how it influenced him. In Tolkien's Faith, I was able to do some fresh research and uncover what was it like for him to practice his faith in the trenches. Very difficult because they're getting shelled, they're getting moved around from place to place. The availability of the sacraments was very limited, and so the hierarchy did a lot of dispensations in terms of they didn't have to fast. They could receive general absolution if need be, because they're really trying to spiritually support the men in the trenches. And he did make a real effort to, maintain going to confession, receiving communion whenever he could, even while he was in the trenches. This is a really important part of his spiritual life. And he also develops a spirituality of memorized prayer. He alluded to this many years later in some advice to his son Christopher, that if he's ever in a situation when he can't go to mass, like when you're in the trenches, that he would call to mind the whole canon of the mass. So he had the whole canon of the mass memorized, which is really kind of astonishing. So we can picture him, in the trenches with his, his metal hat and his, going in his mind through all the prayers of the mass as a devotional exercise. So he takes his faith very seriously, and he develops, even further his Marian devotion. He writes a poem actually to Mary called Consolatrix Afflictorum, consoler of the afflicted. And there's actually an interesting connection to Arwen in The Lord of the Rings, which too detailed to get into here, but I talk about it in the book. So there's a little teaser. And he comes through with his faith intact. And this is in a way surprising, because so many young men of his generation had their faith destroyed in the Great War, or they went in as atheists and stayed atheists. His future friend C.S. Lewis was an atheist, when he went into the war, and that never changed, until afterwards, after the war. But there's interesting, looking at the historical context, because the Catholics fared much better in terms of sustaining their faith than their co-religionists among the Anglicans, because Anglicanism is a very big tent, and people, any soldier who signed up, if they didn't specify otherwise, would get labeled Church of England. So Church of England covered a lot of people who maybe didn't have even a particularly sincere Christian faith, but they're just sort of culturally accepting that label. Whereas to be a Catholic, you didn't call yourself a Catholic unless you meant it. So that meant that when Tolkien encountered other Catholics amongst, like for instance, amongst his fellow Lancashire Fusiliers, he would know that they really meant it, right? So there's more of a spiritual support network there. And I think another key factor in him sustaining his faith in this nightmarish situation is that he had really already faced up to the problem of suffering. I mean, he was an orphan. His father had died when he was a baby. His mother had died. His beloved mother had died. And I am sure that this is something that the teenage Tolkien had to wrestle with very deeply. Why did God allow my mother to die? And I think that developed some real spiritual muscle for him, so that when he got into the trenches, he had grappled with it and he was able to see, okay, this is terrible, but this is not the whole picture. And so he comes out of the war then with his faith still intact. Now, it's interesting that he does, in fact, go through a slump in his faith, but it's after the war. It's after he's demobilized. And maybe we can talk more about that if you want to.
That's excellent. I also wanted to ask you, since you mentioned C.S. Lewis, my fellow Irishman, it'd be maybe remiss of me not to ask a bit more about that relationship, because you go into a lot of the strengths and the weaknesses of that friendship. So I want to ask first of all how they came to meet and what role Tolkien had in moving Lewis from a friend even to becoming a fellow Christian. And then we can either he at this point or maybe later come to the difficulty, especially pertaining to what you label the ulterior motive of C.S. Lewis, which is really interesting from my perspective, given my Ulster identity. And I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so we'll jump ahead in time. So Tolkien is now he's just accepted a position as a professor at Oxford. He'd been in Leeds. So in 1926, he's come back to Oxford. He's a professor, and he attends an English faculty meeting, and that's where he first meets C.S. Lewis, who never became a professor at Oxford, but was a don, was a tutor there. And no particularly positive impression was made at that first meeting. Lewis records in his diary that he had met Tolkien, and he says he called him a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. So Tolkien didn't exactly make a resounding impact on Lewis when they first met. But as they got to know each other, at faculty meetings, a little bit of chit chat, they discovered that they both loved the Norse sagas and all the epics, and that interested both of them. Oh, here's somebody who likes the same thing that I do. And Tolkien has started a little club called the Coal Biters to read Old Norse and Old Icelandic texts in the original, as one does. and Lewis joined that club, and so they're bonding over this sincere appreciation of the old sagas, not just as interesting texts for academic study, but as exciting stories. That's something that these two men, I think, would have recognized immediately as being special. And so a couple of years later, Tolkien really kind of takes an important step. He makes himself vulnerable. He shows Lewis a poem he's written from his legendarium. It's actually the story of Beren and Luthien, the mortal human and the elvish princess, which is one of the most beautiful stories of the legendarium. And it's one that has a real personal connection because Tolkien associated Beren and Luthien with himself and his wife, Edith. The names are even engraved on their gravestone in Wolvercut Cemetery. And he gives it to Lewis and asks for his feedback. And Tolkien was always shy about sharing his work and very sensitive, even, I think, oversensitive about criticism. So it was really a brave move for him to do this. It could have gone really badly. But Lewis had a genius for understanding how to give good feedback. And first of all, he warmly just enthuses, I really enjoyed this. So that hugely affirming. And then he goes through and he makes suggestions on how to improve it. He does it in this really clever way. He makes it that there are 4 different scholars who are arguing about the authentic reading. Oh, line 9 cannot possibly be the authentic reading. It must be a mistake since the scribe knew better. It's just such a clever way of suggesting revisions without being pushy and without being critical. And Tolkien loved it. And he actually did make some revisions according to those suggestions, although he never finished the poem. So many things he didn't finish. But the most important effect of that was that they became very good friends. And they began having all sorts of conversations, sometimes staying up late into the night. And these conversations included talking about Christianity, because Lewis, as I alluded to before, he was raised Christian in Ireland, in a very anti-Catholic setting, in the very, the Ulster being, the characteristically anti-Catholic, perspective. And then he'd become an atheist for various reasons. And then in the 1920s, he begins to move toward theism, believing in God, for various reasons that he unpacks in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. So we get to the point where Lewis has come to believe in God, but he can't manage to believe in Christianity. There's kind of a block there. He just can't grasp it. And that's where Tolkien really helped him. that Tolkien helps him to see that Christianity is also a story, just like the Greek myths, just like the Norse myths that Lewis loves, but it's just a story that is also true. It's a myth that happened in history. And that really helps Lewis to get over the last obstacle and to become a Christian. And then becomes famous as the most famous Christian apologist of the 20th century, even 21st century. But that was really a pivotal role that Tolkien had at that moment in Lewis's life. Now, Lewis went back to being an Anglican, didn't become a Catholic. It's sometimes said that, oh, Tolkien was really disappointed and sad about this. I have found no evidence that that was the case. Tolkien obviously would have wanted Lewis to become a Catholic, because as a Catholic, he would want everybody to become a Catholic. This is the fullness of the faith. But one of the characteristics of Tolkien's spirituality, and this really anticipates Vatican II, he was really very ecumenically minded. He was able to recognize in his Anglican friends that these are fellow Christians, separated brethren, but brethren. And he's able to carry on really strong friendships, spiritual friendships with non-Catholic Christians. And so I think that, yeah, he would have wished Lewis would become a Catholic. I don't think it bothered him. I think he was able to very fully recognize, yeah, he is my brother in Christ. Now, you mentioned the ulterior motive, and that's something a phrase that Tolkien came up with, because he was troubled by what he perceived as certain twinges of anti-Catholicism in Lewis that he attributed to his Ulster upbringing. And interestingly, Lewis himself recognized that. He recognized that he had had certain prejudices instilled in him, he said, that he was striving to overcome. But he hadn't perfectly overcome them, but he was trying. And so Tolkien was sometimes quite pained. And as I mentioned before, he could be oversensitive. At one point, he had Tolkien to mention to Lewis that he had a devotion to St. John the Evangelist. And apparently, Lewis just said, I can't imagine anybody, more dissimilar. A little passing remark, okay. And Tolkien was just mortified. He took it as just a put down, and it rankled with him for decades. And I am sure that Lewis forgot the remark 5 minutes after he made it. So I think Tolkien could be a little oversensitive to perceived anti-Catholicism. And it's in that context that, there were the occasional sort of sparks, but they were just sparks because they had that settled friendship. There's kind of a myth that floats around that their friendship broke or that it ended. And I am very happy to say I've looked into this very carefully. It's not true. They never stopped being friends. Now, there's a couple of key points. One is that, hey, they're busy professional men, and Tolkien had 4 children, and then later he had grandchildren. They're just busy. And then in the 50s, Lewis starts commuting to Cambridge during the week to be professor at Cambridge, a position that Tolkien moved heaven and earth to get for him. That's a good friend. And so they just don't have as much time to spend with each other. That's just called being a person in your middle of your career. So they both, I think, regretted that they didn't have as much time to spend with each other, but between work and family, that just is what it is. Now, when Lewis got married late in life, that caused a bit of a strain. Partly it was because Lewis married Joy Davidman, who was divorced. And Tolkien was very concerned about this, naturally, because as a Catholic, he's worried that Lewis is getting himself into, an adulterous relationship. This is not good for his friend. He's worried. And that's what we see in his comments and in the recollection of his friends. He's just worried about Lewis. Now, as it turns out, Lewis's wife, Joy, her ex-husband had himself already been divorced when he married her. So in the Catholic understanding, she actually had never been married properly the first time. So she was, in fact, free to marry Lewis. And I don't know for certain that Tolkien found this out, but I'm pretty sure that he did. And if he did, it would have really made him feel, okay, this is okay. You know, danger we can turn off the red alert. This is okay. But I think what was actually more unsettling for him personally was the very odd circumstances of Lewis's marriage, because first he marries Joy in a civil ceremony just as a friend so that she can stay in England because she's an American, her visa expired. It's a bit of an odd thing to do. But what's even odder is he didn't tell anybody. Tolkien's his good friend, and he didn't tell him. Tolkien found out a year later from somebody else. And Lewis then goes on to marry her in a proper Christian, ceremony. So I think he was quite naturally pained that his friend didn't tell him that he got married. This is, naturally a bit awkward, but they got over it. And if you look, as I did, at, when did they meet? When did they write to each other? We see them resuming their friendship, despite being busy, and renewing it. And then Lewis dies at the age of only 64. He died relatively young. And Tolkien is absolutely devastated. He says it's like an axe was put to the root of my tree. He's brokenhearted. And I think that is the greatest testament to the way that their friendship was sustained. And I think surely he must have been regretting, why didn't I find more time for him? That's one of the great tragedies. They were busy, and I think they both assumed that, when we have more time, when we're both retired, and that day never came because Lewis died quite young.
I suppose that's a theme of your work that I most appreciate is this message of hope. You got it in the love story, you got it in the friendship, and actually that in some ways might take us to the end of the book. We're missing out a lot of gold. Some people are going to have to actually take and read, as the saying goes. And but I'd love to close this evening / this afternoon by asking about the end of the book. And you mentioned, especially for someone like Tolkien, who's obsessed with the language and the power of language, the significance of the name Rule, and ultimately, I suppose, how the resurrection in Tolkien's work then each shine a light on his death, and we hope his future resurrection.
Yeah. So Tolkien had, John Ronald Reuel were his given names, and he took Philip as his confirmation name, which is its own interesting story, which we don't have time to go into. So Reuel, it's a name that actually goes back to the Old Testament. It's the name of Moses' father-in-law, and it means friend of God. And Tolkien found this name to be very significant. I mean, it was given to him as a family name, but it was so important to him that he gave it to each one of his children. All 4 children, his 3 sons and his daughter, all got Reuel as a middle name. So clearly, this is a name that really had a profound resonance with him. And so it became a useful kind of way to meditate, because what did it mean to Tolkien, to be a Christian? And that was to be striving to be a friend of God. And that's what the saints are, the friends of God. And Tolkien was very well aware that he was not perfect. He had his flaws. And I think it's good to recognize that, because it wasn't just any good to make him a plaster saint and put him on a pedestal, because then we can't really even relate to him. He was no plaster saint, but he was a very good man, precisely because he kept falling and getting up again. He knew the power of going to confession. That's why, he goes to confession regularly, because he knew he needed it. And he's always striving to be that friend of God. And he's striving to live out what our Lord tells us to do. And that, I think, is what, year after year, in all the little details, it builds up to a life that I think is really beautiful. It's a beautiful kind of friendship with God. And that makes it, I think, all the more hopeful. You mentioned the image of the resurrection, and this is something that Tolkien found really central to his life and to his work. And in his great essay on fairy stories, he talks about the happy ending of a fairy story, and he invents the word Eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe, to describe that amazing feeling that we get with the unexpected happy ending. Like, oh, we think that Frodo and Sam are everything is lost, but look, here come the eagles. So the Eucatastrophe is that happy ending that comes when you think everything is lost. You're about to tip over into despair, and that's when hope is renewed, and you're brought forward into the happy ending. Well, we love those in stories, but why do we respond that way? And Tolkien actually makes a connection to the resurrection. He says that this is the great Eucatastrophe. It's the happy ending that really happened in history. He says that the incarnation is the Eucatastrophe of all of human history, and then that the resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the incarnation, and that kind of cosmic happy ending resonates throughout everything. And so whenever we rejoice in a happy ending, we're actually, in some small way, even if we don't know it, we're actually participating in the joy of the resurrection. And that's something that I think we see in all of his work, because there's a lot of darkness in, there's actually quite a lot of darkness, even in the Lord of the Rings, even in the Hobbits, more than we might expect. And then there's that gleam of light. And then we look at Tolkien's own life, so many things that he struggled with. He lost his father, he lost his mother, painful separation from his wife. He fought in the trenches of the Great War. He got trench fever that permanently damaged his health. He had chronic health problems his entire life. He's short of money for most of his life until, the Lord of the Rings made him a success quite late in life. He had so many difficulties, and yet he keeps going. And with his eyes on that resurrection hope. And I think that sort of perseverance is just such a beautiful story.
Amen. That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you for your time today. I suppose then, just ultimately, where can my viewers or listeners find out more about the book and follow you in your work then?
Oh, well, they can go to my website, which is hollyordway.com, and that gives sort of overview of my work. And then for the book, for Tolkien's Faith, if you go to wordonfire.org/Tolkien, it will take you to the main page for the book. It has a number of other videos, a couple of interviews. And now I'm happy to say that the book is available worldwide. So you don't have to be in America to buy it. There's a UK store, there's a Europe store in Word on Fire. So you can, you can buy it from Blackwell's, the UK supplier. That's probably your best bet in the UK, unless you go through Word on Fire. So you can order it in Blackwell's or Word on Fire's UK store, which I think is actually based in Ireland. So there you go. Very fast shipping.
That's great. Thank you so much, Holly. I appreciate it, and God bless you and your work.
My pleasure. My pleasure.